Marie Curie's life unfolded not in chapters, but in half-lives, each breakthrough releasing a new light into the world, and taking something from her in return. Prologue: Light Before the Darkness. In 1995, Marie Curie's coffin was opened and transferred to the Pantheon in Paris, where France entombs its immortals. The pallbearers wore protective suits. Her remains, after 61 years in the earth, were still dangerously radioactive, emitting the same invisible light she had spent her life studying. The woman who discovered radium had become radium. Her body, like the elements she isolated, continued its slow, inexorable decay, releasing energy into the void. This is the central paradox of Marie Curie's life. Every light she created cast a shadow. Every discovery that illuminated the structure of matter also revealed depths of danger no one had imagined. She gave the world a new understanding of energy, transformation, and the hidden architecture of atoms. And in doing so, she gave the world both radium therapy and radium poisoning, both nuclear medicine and nuclear weapons, both the promise of limitless energy and the specter of radioactive contamination that would outlast empires. Her life unfolded as a sequence of half-lives, periods of transformation marked by loss, renewal, and decay. Born into a Poland that did not exist on any map, she forged her will in secret rooms, where education was rebellion. She married into a partnership of luminous intellectual communion, only to lose it in an instant of brutal accident. She won unprecedented recognition, then faced public destruction. She illuminated battlefields with X-rays that saved thousands, while the elements she discovered slowly consumed her from within. The glow that made her famous, the faint blue radiance of radium in a darkened shed, became the defining image of an age. But that same glow would poison factory workers, burn the hands of researchers, and plant the seeds of technologies that could annihilate cities. Marie Curie stood at the threshold of the atomic age, and the light she carried forward was neither purely benevolent nor purely destructive. It was simply powerful, a force that exceeded human capacity to fully control or comprehend. This is not a story of simple triumph. It is a story of brilliant illumination and profound cost, of scientific clarity and personal suffering, of a woman who transformed our understanding of matter while her own body was transformed by the very substances she studied. It is a story measured not in years alone, but in half-lives, the time it takes for half of a radioactive substance to decay, to release its energy, to become something other than what it was. Marie Curie's first half-life began in a city that was not allowed to exist. Chapter 1: The Secret Education of Maria Skłodowska. Warsaw in 1867 was a wound that would not heal. The city that witnessed Maria Skłodowska's birth on November 7th of that year was officially a provincial capital of the Russian Empire, its Polish identity systematically erased by decree. Street signs were in Russian. Government posts were reserved for Russians. Polish history was forbidden in schools. The Catholic churches, once centers of national identity, operated under constant surveillance. To be Polish in Warsaw was to live a double life, to present compliance to Russian authorities while preserving in secret the language, literature, and memory of a nation that had been partitioned out of existence. The Skłodowski family understood this duality intimately. Maria's father, Władysław, was a mathematics and physics teacher whose career had been systematically diminished by Russian administrators suspicious of his Polish patriotism. He had been demoted, moved to inferior positions, watched. His crime was subtle. He taught with passion, with cultural pride, with an insistence that knowledge was a form of resistance. In his household, despite poverty and surveillance, he maintained a small collection of scientific instruments: glass tubes, a barometer, an electroscope, objects that spoke of a world governed by universal laws rather than imperial caprice. Maria's mother, Bronisława, was a woman of severe intelligence and deep Catholic faith, the headmistress of a girls' school until tuberculosis forced her resignation. The disease that would eventually kill her began its slow consumption when Maria was young, casting the household in a double shadow. The political oppression outside, the biological decay within. Maria learned early that loss was gradual, that vitality could drain away over years, that one could live for a long time in the presence of death. The family lived in cramped quarters, economic circumstances worsening as Władysław lost positions and invested unwisely. They took in boarding students to supplement income. The apartment was crowded, noisy, filled with the smell of cooking and the sound of recitation. Yet Władysław insisted on intellectual rigor. He read to his children from Polish poets, banned in schools. He taught them science and mathematics at the kitchen table. He instilled in them the understanding that education was not merely a path to employment. It was an act of defiance, a way to preserve what empires sought to erase. Maria's earliest memory of scientific apparatus came from her father's small glass-fronted cabinet. She was barely 5 years old, but the instruments mesmerized her. Their precision, their gleaming surfaces, their promise of hidden truths about the physical world. She would stand before the cabinet, silent, absorbed, as though the instruments themselves emitted some invisible light only she could perceive. But the light in Maria's childhood was constantly threatened by darkness. When she was 8, her oldest sister Zosia contracted typhus, likely from contaminated water or close contact with a sick classmate. The disease moved swiftly: fever, delirium, death. Maria watched her sister's body carried out in a small coffin. 2 years later, her mother's long struggle with tuberculosis ended. Bronisława died when Maria was 10, leaving a void that would shape the girl's emotional landscape for the rest of her life. Maria's response to grief was withdrawal. She turned inward, into books, into solitary study, into a kind of emotional austerity that would become her trademark. She excelled at the Russian-run gymnasium, mastering languages with mechanical precision: Russian, French, German, English, while simultaneously attending clandestine Polish schools that met in private homes, rotated locations to avoid detection, and taught the history and literature that official curricula erased. This was the Flying University, an underground network of educators and students who defied Russian prohibitions on higher education, particularly for women. Classes met in cramped apartments, in rented rooms, in spaces that could be abandoned quickly if informants reported them. Students arrived separately, carried no identifying materials, and risked arrest for the privilege of learning. Maria attended lectures on anatomy, on natural sciences, on sociology and positivism. The belief that social progress came through scientific education and rational reform, rather than violent uprising. The atmosphere was electric, dangerous, intellectually intoxicating. Knowledge became contraband. Every lesson carried the thrill of transgression. Maria absorbed not only content, but ethos, that learning was inherently political, that to educate oneself was to claim autonomy from those who would control thought, that science itself could be an instrument of liberation. But liberation required money, and money required sacrifice. After graduating from the gymnasium at 15, with a gold medal, top of her class, Maria faced the brutal reality that universities in Russian Poland did not admit women. Her older sister Bronia dreamed of studying medicine in Paris, but the family had no resources to send her. So Maria made a pact. She would work as a governess, sending her earnings to Bronia, and when Bronia finished her degree and began her medical practice, she would support Maria in turn. It was an arrangement born of necessity and mutual devotion, but it consigned Maria to years of isolation and subordination. At 18, she took a position in a rural manor, teaching the children of a beet sugar factory owner. The work was mind-numbing. The family treated her with the casual condescension reserved for hired servants. She was educated enough to instruct children, but not esteemed enough to dine with adults. During this period, Maria fell in love with Kazimierz Żurawski, the eldest son of the household. He was a mathematics student, intellectually engaged, seemingly sympathetic to her ambitions. They planned to marry, but when Kazimier's parents learned of the attachment, they forbade it outright. A governess, however intelligent, was not a suitable match for their son. Kazimierz capitulated. Maria was devastated, not merely by romantic rejection, but by the realization that her intellect, her character, her very self, were subordinate to questions of class and propriety. The wound scarred over, but never fully healed. In later years, she would speak of this period only obliquely, as a time when she learned that the world was not interested in fairness, that talent and dedication guaranteed nothing, that one's worth was determined by forces indifferent to merit. She spent 3 years into this governess position, then moved to another, equally stultifying. She read voraciously physics, chemistry, sociology, literature in 4 languages. She conducted small chemical experiments in secret using makeshift equipment. She corresponded with her father and sisters, describing her loneliness in restrained prose. She endured. In 1889, Bronia, now married to a fellow Polish physician in Paris, wrote with the long-awaited invitation, "Come, you can stay with us. You can study." Maria was 23 years old. She had been waiting for this permission to live her life for nearly a decade. In November 1891, she boarded a third-class train to Paris, carrying a folding chair, a few possessions, and the accumulated hunger of years. She would never live permanently in Poland again. But Poland, its language, its suffering, its resistance, would remain the subterranean current of everything she became. The first half-life had ended. The next was beginning. Chapter 2. Paris, Hunger, Light, and the Meeting of Two Minds. Paris did not greet Maria Skłodowska with grandeur. It greeted her with cold. She arrived at the Gare du Nord in late autumn, the sky gray, the streets wet with rain. Bronia and her husband met her, brought her to their small apartment in the Latin Quarter, and for a few weeks, Maria adjusted to the overwhelming strangeness of the city, the crowds, the noise, the freedom. After years of surveillance and suppression in Poland, Paris offered something intoxicating and disorienting: the right to move, unmonitored, to speak without fear, to pursue knowledge without clandestine arrangement. But Bronia's apartment was far from the Sorbonne, and the commute consumed hours Maria could not afford to waste. More critically, the apartment was filled with the sounds of domestic life, conversations, visitors, the rhythms of marriage that intruded on Maria's singular focus. She needed solitude. She needed proximity to the university. She needed deprivation, not comfort, because comfort felt like distraction. So she moved into a garret in the Latin Quarter, a 6th-floor walk-up, unheated, barely furnished, a narrow bed, a small table, a washstand, a single oil lamp, no running water on the floor. In winter, the temperature inside the room often fell below freezing. She wore all the clothes she owned to bed, layered under thin blankets, and woke to find the water in her wash basin frozen solid. She cooked rudimentary meals on a small alcohol burner: bread, eggs, occasionally a bit of chocolate or fruit. She fainted several times from malnutrition and cold. But she was happy. This is the paradox that defined Maria's years at the Sorbonne. She was starving, freezing, exhausted, and more fulfilled than she had ever been. The university offered her access to laboratories, libraries, and lectures by some of the most distinguished scientists in Europe. Gabriel Lippmann in physics, Henri Poincaré in mathematics, Paul Appel in rational mechanics. She sat in amphitheaters alongside hundreds of male students, one of perhaps 24 women in the Faculty of Sciences, and she absorbed everything. Her French was initially halting, heavily accented, but she mastered it with characteristic discipline. She studied late into the night, her lamp flickering, her breath visible in the frigid air. She took notes in a meticulous hand, transcribing lectures verbatim, reviewing them methodically. She learned experimental techniques, the use of precision instruments, the protocols of measurement that separated rigorous science from speculation. At the Sorbonne, she encountered a culture utterly different from the clandestine Polish education of her youth. Here, science was institutionalized, hierarchical, competitive. Reputation mattered, patronage mattered. The ability to secure laboratory space, funding, and publication determined one's trajectory. Women were tolerated but not embraced. Maria was occasionally subjected to condescension, to colleagues who assumed she was dilettante or a distraction. But her performance was so consistently excellent that skepticism gave way to grudging respect. In 1893, she passed her license in physics, finishing first in her class. The following year, she passed her license in mathematics, finishing second. These were not merely personal triumphs. They were validations of a belief she had carried from Poland. That intellect transcended nationality, gender, and class. That knowledge was the one arena where merit could not be wholly suppressed. During this period, Maria supported herself through small scholarships and tutoring work, but money remained scarce. She wore the same threadbare coat through multiple winters. She walked everywhere to save centimes. When she became ill from malnutrition, Branya intervened, bringing her soup and rest, then watching her sister return immediately to the relentless discipline that defined her existence. But Maria's asceticism was not merely about poverty, it was about focus. She had spent her youth waiting for permission, waiting for resources, waiting for life to begin. Now that she had access to laboratories and libraries, she would not dilute her time with comfort or leisure. Science required total commitment. She gave it. In 1894, seeking space and equipment to study the magnetic properties of steel, an assignment from the Society for the Encouragement of National Industry, Maria was introduced to Pierre Curie by a mutual Polish friend. Pierre was then 35 years old, a modest, introspective physicist known for his work on crystallography and magnetism. He and his brother Jacques had discovered piezoelectricity, the phenomenon by which certain crystals generate electric charges under mechanical stress, a finding with profound implications for precision measurement. Pierre had also invented sensitive instruments, including a highly refined electrometer that could detect extraordinarily weak electrical currents. Pierre Curie was, in many ways, Maria's intellectual mirror. He came from a modest Parisian family with Republican sympathies and a deep respect for science. His father, a physician, had homeschooled Pierre and his brother, cultivating their curiosity rather than subjecting them to rigid institutional curricula. Pierre had never pursued conventional academic advancement. He disdained careerism, avoided political maneuvering, and preferred the quiet purity of experimental research to the performance of academic life. He was also solitary, emotionally reserved, and prone to melancholy, traits that made him an outsider in the gregarious, politically charged world of Parisian science. When he met Maria, he was immediately struck by her intensity, her discipline, her evident devotion to work. She was equally impressed by his intellectual seriousness and his remarkable instruments. They began meeting to discuss physics. Their conversations ranged across crystallography, magnetism, the nature of matter, the philosophical implications of scientific discovery. Pierre lent Maria access to his laboratory. He shared his instruments. They worked in parallel, then in collaboration. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, their intellectual partnership acquired emotional depth. Pierre fell in love first. Or at least, he articulated it first. He was captivated not by frivolity or charm, but by Maria's austerity, her refusal to perform femininity, her absolute commitment to understanding the physical world. He proposed that they work together, not merely as colleagues, but as partners in life. He imagined a shared existence devoted entirely to science, free from social obligations and bourgeois distractions. Maria hesitated. She had planned to return to Poland, to teach, to contribute to the national cause. She was wary of marriage, having witnessed its capacity to subordinate women's ambitions to domestic obligation. Moreover, she barely knew Pierre. Their acquaintance had been brief, intense, but still largely professional. Pierre persisted. He wrote her letters of extraordinary tenderness and intellectual respect. He argued that their partnership could be stronger than either of them alone, that they could build a life organized entirely around discovery. He was willing to move to Poland if that was what she required. He made it clear that he saw her not as an ornament to his career, but as an equal, a collaborator whose mind he revered. Maria returned to Poland in the summer of 1894, uncertain, but Poland, after Paris, felt constricting. The opportunities for women in science were non-existent. The political climate remained oppressive, and Pierre's letters continued to arrive, patient, thoughtful, unwavering in their conviction that they belonged together. In the summer of 1895, Maria returned to Paris and agreed to marry Pierre. The wedding was a small, secular affair. No white dress, no religious ceremony, no elaborate celebration. They wore simple, dark clothing. A handful of friends attended. Afterward, they bicycled into the countryside for a honeymoon, spent examining geological formations and discussing the properties of crystals. It was, by any conventional standard, an odd marriage, but it was also, by all evidence, a profoundly happy one. They had created a partnership built on mutual intellectual devotion, on the shared belief that science was the highest calling, on the understanding that their lives would be organized around discovery rather than comfort or social advancement. They moved into a small apartment. They worked in Pierre's laboratory at the School of Physics and Chemistry. They lived frugally, indifferent to material accumulation. They spent evenings reading scientific papers aloud to each other, discussing experiments, planning research. They were, in the language of the time, anti-social, not hostile to others, but utterly absorbed in their shared project, indifferent to the rituals of bourgeois Parisian life. In 1897, Maria gave birth to their first daughter, Irene. The pregnancy had been difficult, the birth exhausting, but Maria resumed work within weeks, hiring a nurse to care for the infant while she returned to the laboratory. Motherhood, she decided, would not interrupt her scientific trajectory. It would coexist with it somehow, through sheer force of will and meticulous scheduling. By this time, Maria was searching for a topic for her doctoral thesis, a project that would demonstrate original research and earn her the title of Doctor of Science, a credential that would legitimize her presence in the male-dominated world of French physics. She needed a problem that was both tractable and significant, something that had not been thoroughly investigated, something that offered the possibility of real discovery. In late 1897, she found it. Henri Becquerel, a physicist at the Museum of Natural History, had reported a curious phenomenon. Uranium salts emitted rays that could expose photographic plates even when wrapped in opaque paper. The rays seemed to come from the uranium itself, not from any external energy source. Becquerel had explored the phenomenon briefly, then largely abandoned it, uncertain of its significance. Maria, reading Becquerel's papers, sensed something profound beneath the surface. If uranium emitted energy continuously, without any apparent external input, it suggested that the atom itself, long considered indivisible and inert, might be the source. This was a radical idea, the prevailing view, inherited from ancient Greek atomism and refined by 19th century chemistry, held that atoms were the fundamental, unchanging units of matter. They combined and recombined in chemical reactions, but they did not transform or emit energy spontaneously. Becquerel's rays suggested otherwise. They suggested that atoms were not inert but active, that they possessed internal structure, that they could release energy over time. If this were true, it would fundamentally alter the understanding of matter. Maria decided to investigate the phenomenon systematically. Pierre offered his most sensitive instrument, the electrometer he had developed, to measure the weak electrical currents produced by the rays. Together, they transformed a ground floor storeroom at the School of Physics into a makeshift laboratory. The space was damp, poorly lit, filled with the smell of coal smoke and chemical fumes. It was utterly inadequate. It was perfect. The second half-life was beginning, and with it, the glow that would change everything. Chapter 3: The Shed That Lit Up the World. The work began with precision. Maria set out to measure the intensity of radiation emitted by various substances, using Pierre's electrometer to detect the faint ionization currents the rays produced in air. She tested pure uranium, then uranium compounds, then a variety of minerals known to contain uranium. The method was tedious, exacting, repetitive, exactly suited to her temperament. The first discovery came quickly. Thorium, another heavy element, also emitted rays similar to uranium's. This was significant. It meant the phenomenon was not unique to uranium, but was a property shared by certain elements. Maria coined a term for this new property: radioactivity. She defined it as an atomic characteristic, independent of the element's chemical state or physical conditions. Whether uranium was in metallic form, dissolved in acid, heated or cooled, its radioactivity remained constant. This suggested that radioactivity originated deep within the atom itself, not from molecular arrangements or external influences. But the truly astonishing finding emerged when Maria tested pitchblende, a heavy, tar-like uranium ore. Pitchblende's radioactivity was far greater than could be accounted for by its uranium content alone. Even after chemically separating the uranium from the ore, the residue remained intensely radioactive, more so than pure uranium. The implication was inescapable. Pitchblende contained an unknown element, far more radioactive than uranium, that had never been identified. Maria and Pierre repeated the measurements obsessively, verifying the result, eliminating possible errors. The conclusion held. There was something new in the ore, something that emitted extraordinary energy. They resolved to isolate it. This decision transformed their work from measurement to industrial chemistry. Pitchblende was not a laboratory curiosity, it was a mined ore, processed for its uranium content, then discarded. Tons of it sat in waste heaps at the Joachimsthal mine in Bohemia, now part of Austria-Hungary. The Curies arranged to acquire several tons of the residue, paying shipping costs out of their modest savings. When the material arrived in Paris, delivered in sacks to the School of Physics, it was heavy, black, slightly sticky, smelling of chemicals. The Curies had no proper facilities to process it. The only available space was an abandoned wooden shed behind the school, formerly used for medical dissections, with a leaky glass roof, and minimal ventilation. In summer, the temperature inside became stifling. In winter, it was barely warmer than the street outside. Rain sometimes pooled on the floor. This shed, utterly inadequate by any reasonable standard, became the birthplace of modern nuclear science. Marie and Pierre divided the labor. Pierre focused on the physical properties of the mysterious substance, measuring its radioactivity and spectroscopic characteristics. Maria undertook the chemical separations, boiling enormous quantities of pitch-blende residue in cast iron cauldrons, precipitating fractions, dissolving, and reprecipitating, isolating progressively smaller amounts of progressively more radioactive material. The work was brutal. Maria stirred the boiling mixtures with iron rods nearly as tall as she was, the heat and fumes making her eyes water. Her lungs burned. Her hands cracked and bled from chemical exposure. Her back ached from the physical labor. Each batch of residue had to be processed repeatedly, the radioactive component concentrated step by painstaking step. It was chemistry as manual labor, requiring not just intellectual rigor, but physical endurance. Months passed. A year. The Curies worked late into the evenings, often alone in the cold shed, illuminated by a single gas lamp. They were driven not by external pressure. They had no grants, no deadlines imposed by funders, but by their own compulsion to understand. They were pursuing something invisible, something that revealed itself only through instruments, something that challenged the foundational assumptions of physics and chemistry. In July 1898, after months of fractionation, they isolated a sample with radioactivity 400 times greater than uranium. Spectroscopic analysis revealed a characteristic line not associated with any known element. They announced the discovery of a new element, which Maria named polonium, in honor of her native Poland, a nation that did not officially exist, but that she carried with her as an unhealed wound. But polonium was not the only hidden element in pitchblende. As Maria continued her separations, she found that another fraction, chemically similar to barium, retained intense radioactivity even after polonium was removed. In December 1898, the Curies announced the discovery of a second new element, far more radioactive than polonium. They named it radium, from the Latin word for ray. Radium was extraordinary. Its radioactivity was nearly 1,000,000 times greater than uranium's. It emitted not only the penetrating rays Becquerel had detected, but also a continuous flow of energy, heat, light, ionizing radiation. A small amount of radium sol glowed in the dark, with a faint, ethereal blue-green luminescence. It warmed its own container. It seemed almost alive, as though matter itself were breathing. The Curies invited colleagues to visit the shed at night to witness the phenomenon. In the darkness, vials of radium compounds emitted a soft, otherworldly glow, faint halos of light that seemed to pulse gently, like bioluminescence. Marie later recalled that the sight filled her with a kind of enchanted delight, a sense that they were seeing something fundamental about the nature of reality, something that had been hidden since the universe began. But isolating radium in pure form required even more labor. To obtain a single gram of radium chloride, they needed to process several tons of pitchblende residue. The work consumed 4 more years. Marie boiled, stirred, filtered, crystallized, purified. She became intimately familiar with the physical sensations of radium's presence, the warmth of a sample held in her hand, the skin burns that appeared after prolonged exposure, the faint persistent glow that lingered on her clothing and fingertips after a day's work. Pierre, meanwhile, studied radium's properties systematically. He measured its heat emission, its spectrum, its effects on living tissue. He deliberately exposed his own arm to radium, documenting the progression of the burn: redness, blistering, ulceration, slow healing, that left a permanent scar. This was not masochism, but methodology. He was establishing radium's biological effects through direct observation, using himself as the most readily available experimental subject. The implications of these findings began to permeate the scientific community. If atoms could emit energy spontaneously, continuously, and apparently without limit, then the atom was not the indivisible, static unit chemists had imagined. It had internal structure, it could transform, it could decay. The Curie's work, combined with parallel discoveries by Ernest Rutherford in Canada and England, was dismantling classical atomism and revealing a new picture. Atoms as dynamic systems, composed of smaller particles, capable of undergoing transmutations that released immense amounts of energy. In 1903, Marie Curie completed her doctoral dissertation on radioactive substances. She was examined by a panel that included Gabriel Lippmann and Henri Moissan, two of France's most distinguished scientists. The defense was a formality. Her work was so clearly groundbreaking that no serious challenge was possible. She became the first woman in France to earn a doctorate in science. That same year, the Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded for the discovery of radioactivity. The prize was shared among three people: Henri Becquerel, for his initial observation of uranium rays, Pierre Curie, and Marie Curie, for their joint work, isolating radium and polonium, and elucidating radioactivity's properties. Marie became the first woman to receive a Nobel Prize. The recognition was unprecedented, historic, and almost didn't happen. The Nobel Committee's initial list of nominees had included only Becquerel and Pierre. Marie, despite being the primary investigator on much of the research, despite having discovered polonium and radium, despite having coined the term radioactivity, was excluded. It was only through the intervention of Swedish mathematician Gösta Mittag-Leffler and Pierre's explicit insistence that Marie's contributions were at least equal to his own that her name was added. Even then, public perception framed the prize as Pierre's achievement, with Mary as his devoted assistant. Newspapers described her as Madame Curie, Pierre's wife, the woman who helped him. The gendered dynamics of scientific recognition were laid bare. A man could be a scientist, but a woman could only be a scientist's helpmeet, regardless of her actual contributions. The Curies themselves were ambivalent about the prize. They had not sought fame. They did not enjoy public attention. Pierre, in particular, found the sudden influx of journalists, visitors, and ceremonial obligations deeply distasteful. He referred to the Nobel Prize as the disaster of our lives, not because he was ungrateful, but because it disrupted the quiet intensity of their work. Fame brought other complications: requests for lectures, for appearances, for consultations, journalists wanting interviews, industrialists wanting to commercialize radium, physicians wanting samples for medical experiments. The Curies found themselves at the center of a phenomenon they had not anticipated. Radium, the element they had isolated through years of painstaking labor, was becoming a public obsession. Radium glowed. It emitted energy. It seemed to defy the laws of thermodynamics. It held the promise of miraculous medical cures. It was mysterious, exotic, dangerous, and fascinating. Within a few years, radium would be marketed in patent medicines, cosmetics, and health tonics. It would be hailed as a cure for cancer, arthritis, and impotence. It would be painted on watch dials to make them luminous. It would become both a scientific marvel and a commercial commodity, its dangers obscured by its luminous allure. But in 1903, these developments were still nascent. For the Curies, the Nobel Prize was a validation, but also a burden. They did not want wealth or celebrity. They wanted time, space, and resources to continue their work. Pierre was finally offered a professorship at the Sorbonne. a position he had been denied repeatedly despite his scientific achievements. The honor came too late and for the wrong reasons. It came because he had won a prize, not because the institution valued his work. Marie, meanwhile, had no official academic position. She taught occasionally, worked in Pierre's laboratory, and continued processing radium samples. She was recognized internationally, but not institutionally. The French Academy of Sciences, France's most prestigious scientific body, remained closed to women. When Pierre was proposed for membership, he was rejected twice. It was a humiliation he bore quietly, emblematic of the conservative, hierarchical nature of French scientific institutions. The Curie's personal life during these years was marked by fatigue, illness, and intermittent happiness. They had a second daughter, Eve, born in 1904. Pierre's health was declining. Chronic pain, possibly from radiation exposure, possibly from exhaustion. Marie suffered from fatigue and miscarriages. They took occasional holidays, cycling through the countryside, trying to recover some of the vitality that the work consumed. In the summer of 1906, Pierre was elected to the Academy. He had finally, grudgingly, been accepted, but he would never attend a meeting. On April 19, 1906, Pierre Curie stepped off a curb near the Pont Neuf, lost in thought, and was struck by a horse-drawn wagon. The rear wheel crushed his skull. He died instantly. Marie Curie's second half-life ended in an instant. The third began in silence and darkness. Chapter 4. The First Nobel, Recognition and Erasure. Before we proceed to the devastation of Pierre's death, it is necessary to return to the moment of their triumph and examine the nature of the recognition they received, for it reveals the tensions that would define Marie's remaining years, the simultaneous elevation and erasure of her identity, the way fame illuminated her achievements while casting shadows over her autonomy. The 1903 Nobel Prize was transformative, not merely for the honor it conferred, but for the narratives it generated. Newspapers across Europe and America ran stories celebrating the Curies, but the framing was almost universally gendered. Pierre was described as the brilliant physicist, the visionary theorist, the scientific genius. Marie was depicted as his devoted helpmeet, the loyal wife who assisted him, the woman who labored alongside her husband in service to his vision. This narrative was not entirely inaccurate. They had collaborated, but it distorted the reality of their partnership. Marie had initiated the research into radioactivity. She had designed the experimental protocols. She had performed the majority of the chemical separations. She had discovered polonium and radium. Pierre's contributions were substantial. His instruments made precise measurements possible. His theoretical insights shaped their interpretations. But the work was genuinely collaborative, and in many respects, Marie's role was primary. Yet the public imagination struggled to accommodate the image of a woman as the intellectual equal of her husband, much less as the driving force behind a scientific revolution. The narrative required a hierarchy, a clear distinction between the active male scientist and the supportive female assistant. The Nobel Committee's initial exclusion of Marie from the prize nomination reflected this bias, and even after her inclusion, the public reception reinforced it. Marie was acutely aware of this dynamic, but she navigated it with her characteristic restraint. She did not publicly challenge the framing. She did not demand equal billing in press accounts. She focused on the work, allowing the results to speak for themselves, trusting, perhaps naively, that scientific merit would eventually transcend social prejudice. The prize also brought financial recognition, £8,000 sterling, split between the laureates. For the Curies, who had lived frugally for years, this was a substantial sum. They used it to support family members, to fund their research, and to secure a modest improvement in their living conditions. But they resisted the temptation toward luxury. Their lifestyle remained Spartan. They viewed wealth as a resource for continued work, not as an end in itself. More significantly, the prize elevated radium's profile. Physicians began experimenting with radium as a therapeutic agent, particularly in treating cancers and skin lesions. The Curies provided samples to researchers, often without compensation, believing that scientific discoveries should serve humanity rather than enrich individuals. They explicitly refused to patent the process for isolating radium, a decision that would later be celebrated as noble self-sacrifice and criticized as naive idealism. The question of patents reveals one of the central tensions in Marie Curie's life: her belief in the disinterested pursuit of knowledge versus the realities of industrial capitalism. She maintained that science should be freely shared, that discoveries belonged to humanity, that the pursuit of truth was incompatible with the pursuit of profit. This was a beautiful, even heroic stance, but it also meant that others would profit from her work, while she remained financially insecure. Industrial production of radium began almost immediately after the Curies published their methods. Factories in France, Austria, and later America processed pitchblende and other uranium ores, extracting radium for medical and commercial use. Fortunes were made. Radium's price per gram became astronomical. Yet the Curies received almost nothing from this commercialization. They had given away the key to unlock a treasure, then watched others claim the wealth. This dynamic would repeat throughout Marie's life. She would make discoveries of immense practical value, then decline to profit from them, then struggle financially to continue her research, then be celebrated for her selflessness, even as institutions failed to provide adequate support. It was a paradox that honored her while exploiting her, that held her up as a martyr to science while denying her the resources that would allow science to flourish. In the years following the Nobel Prize, Pierre's academic position at the Sorbonne finally improved. He was given a laboratory, a modest budget, and the title of chair of physics. Marie was appointed as his chief of laboratory, a subordinate position, but one that gave her institutional standing. They began to build a research group, training students, expanding investigations into radioactivity and its properties. But the work exacted a toll. Both Marie and Pierre showed signs of chronic illness, fatigue, pain, memory difficulties. They attributed it to overwork, to the stress of their labors. They did not yet fully understand that they were being slowly poisoned by the substances they handled daily. Radium emitted alpha particles, beta particles, and gamma rays, forms of radiation that penetrated tissue, damaged cells, disrupted biological processes. The Curies worked with radium compounds without gloves, without protective clothing, without ventilation. They stored radioactive samples into their desks, carried them into their pockets, handled them with bare hands. Pierre's deliberate self-experiment, exposing his arm to radium to document the burn, was emblematic of their attitude. Radiation was a tool, a phenomenon to be studied, not a hazard to be feared. They were aware that radium could cause harm. Pierre's burn took months to heal, leaving a permanent scar. But they did not extrapolate from this acute injury to the chronic effects of low-level exposure. This blindness to danger was not unique to the Curies. The entire early community of radioactivity researchers operated with minimal safety precautions. Samples were stored in open containers. Experiments were conducted in poorly ventilated rooms. Radioactive substances were handled with tweezers, pipettes, and bare fingers. The invisible rays that had once seemed mysterious and exciting would, in time, reveal themselves as invisible threats, sources not just of scientific insight, but of biological destruction. But in 1906, these realizations were still nascent. The Curies, despite their fatigue and ailments, continued working. They planned new experiments. They discussed future directions. They imagined years, decades, of continued collaboration. And then, in a single moment on a rainy Paris street, that future was obliterated. Chapter 5. Widowhood, the sudden decay. The news reached Marie in the early afternoon. Pierre had been struck by a wagon. He was dead. She did not scream. She did not collapse. She stood very still, as though frozen, and then she asked to see his body. They brought her to the morgue. Pierre's head had been crushed. The sight was beyond description, beyond what any narrative can adequately convey. She stood beside the body for a long time, silent, then bent and kissed his face. In the days that followed, Marie Curie entered a state that can only be described as psychological suspension. She moved through the necessary arrangements, the funeral, the burial in Sceaux, the condolences from colleagues and dignitaries. But she moved as though automated, as though her conscious self had retreated somewhere inward and inaccessible. She began keeping a journal addressed to Pierre, as though he were still alive, as though he could hear her. The entries are among the most intimate and harrowing documents she left behind. They reveal a woman in freefall, clinging to the memory of her husband as the only stable point in a collapsing world. They filled the coffin and put flowers on it, she wrote. They closed it, and I could see nothing more. They put the coffin in the hearse and took you away. Jacques and I followed. We saw you go down into the deep grave. Then the dreadful procession of people. They wanted to take us away. Jacques and I resisted. Finally, we went away. We had to. We didn't want to leave you alone in your sad house. I haven't forgotten you. You can be sure of that. The journal continued for months, a one-sided dialogue with the dead. She described her daily life in meticulous detail, as though reporting to him. She described her sorrow, her loneliness, her inability to find meaning in a world emptied of his presence. She described waking each morning and forgetting, for an instant, that he was gone, then remembering, and the remembering as a fresh blow each time. The world outside demanded responses. The Sorbonne, in an unprecedented gesture, offered Marie Pierre's chair, making her the first woman professor in the university's 700-year history. She accepted, not out of ambition, but out of fidelity. She would continue the work they had begun together. She would carry it forward, not for herself, but for him, as though by maintaining the research, she could maintain some connection to the person she had lost. Her first lecture at the Sorbonne, in November 1906, was a public event. The amphitheater was filled to capacity with students, colleagues, journalists, curiosity seekers. Everyone wanted to see the grieving widow, the first female professor, the woman who would stand in her late husband's place. Marie entered the lecture hall and walked to the podium without preamble. She did not acknowledge the audience's applause. She did not offer any prefatory remarks, any tribute to Pierre, any acknowledgement of the historic nature of the occasion. She simply opened her notes and began speaking at precisely the point where Pierre's last lecture had ended, as though no time had passed, as though the continuity of the work were the only thing that mattered. It was a deliberate, calculated gesture, a refusal to perform grief publicly, a refusal to allow the moment to be about anything other than the science. The audience, expecting sentiment, was given only precision. It was both a tribute to Pierre and an assertion of Marie's own identity. She was not a symbol, not a spectacle, but a scientist. But privately, she was disintegrating. The journal entries reveal a woman tormented by loneliness, by guilt, by the feeling that she had failed to protect Pierre. that she had allowed him to be destroyed by overwork and exhaustion. She wrote of her desire to join him in death, her sense that life without him was purposeless. She described sitting beside his grave for hours, speaking to him, imagining his responses. Her daughters, Irene and Eve, were left largely in the care of their grandfather, Pierre's father, who had moved in after the accident. Marie was present but emotionally absent, her interactions with the children mechanical, dutiful, devoid of warmth. She fed them, bathed them, ensured they were clothed and educated, but she could not engage with them emotionally. Her capacity for intimacy had been consumed by grief. Friends and colleagues tried to offer support, but Marie resisted. She did not want comfort. She did not want distractions. She wanted only to work, because work was the one activity that did not require her to pretend she was whole. So she returned to the laboratory, to the samples of radium, to the measurements and separations. She continued isolating radium in increasingly pure forms, refining methods, training students. She published papers. She presented findings at conferences. She maintained the outward appearance of scientific productivity. But the work was no longer driven by curiosity or joy. It was driven by something closer to compulsion, a need to fill the void, to keep moving so that she would not have to confront the emptiness, waiting whenever she stopped. The loneliness was compounded by her outsider status. Despite her position at the Sorbonne, despite the Nobel Prize, she remained in many respects foreign to the French scientific establishment. She was Polish, a woman, a widow. She did not belong to the networks of patronage and influence that determined careers. She was admired but not embraced. She was respected but not liked. In this isolation, she formed close bonds with a small circle of colleagues who shared her political and intellectual sympathies, scientists who valued internationalism over nationalism, who supported women's education, who saw science as a progressive force. Among them was Paul Langevin, a physicist and former student of Pierre's, who would later become a central figure in one of the most damaging episodes of Marie's life. But for now, in the years immediately following Pierre's death, the primary relationship was with the work itself. Radium became a kind of companion, constant, demanding, luminous. She handled it daily, measured it, purified it, studied its properties. She was exposing herself to radiation levels that would be considered lethal by modern standards. But she either did not recognize the danger or did not care. Perhaps the exposure felt like a form of communion, a way to remain close to the element that had defined her partnership with Pierre. Her health declined. She suffered from anemia, from fatigue, from recurring fevers. She lost weight. Her hands became scarred and burned. She developed cataracts, a direct result of radiation exposure, that would eventually require multiple surgeries. But she did not stop. In 1910, Marie Curie published a monumental treatise on radioactivity, a comprehensive synthesis of all known research on the subject. It was a work of extraordinary intellectual rigor, nearly 1,000 pages long, summarizing a decade of discoveries. It established her as the foremost authority on radioactivity, the inheritor not just of Pierre's work, but of an entire field. But even as her scientific reputation reached its zenith, her personal life was about to be subjected to a public assault of extraordinary viciousness. The third half-life was about to collide with forces that had nothing to do with science and everything to do with the ugliest currents of her era: xenophobia, sexism, and the violent politics of reputation. Chapter 6: Scandal, the Second Nobel, and the Violence of Reputation. The exposure came in November 1911, timed with deliberate malice to coincide with Marie Curie's nomination for membership in the French Academy of Sciences. She was the first woman ever proposed for election to the Academy, a bastion of male scientific privilege that had existed since the 17th century. Her candidacy was controversial from the outset, not because of her scientific credentials, which were impeccable, but because of her gender and nationality. The Academy's members divided into factions. Some supported her election as a recognition of merit and a sign of progress. Others opposed it on principle, arguing that women's temperament and intellect were unsuited to scientific inquiry, that admitting a woman would degrade the institution's standards, that Marie Curie's achievements, however significant, did not outweigh the necessity of preserving tradition. The opposition was led by conservative scientists and amplified by nationalist and anti-feminist elements in the French press. Edouard Branly, a competent but unremarkable physicist, was proposed as the alternative candidate. The election became a referendum not on scientific achievement, but on gender and national identity. Marie lost the vote by 2 ballots. The Academy remained closed to women. The rejection was humiliating, but it was merely the prelude to something worse. 1 week after the Academy vote, the newspaper Le Journal published a front-page story under the headline, "A Story of Love, Madame Curie and Professor Langevin." The article alleged that Marie Curie and Paul Langevin, a married physicist with 4 children, were engaged in an affair. It claimed that Langevin had abandoned his family to live with Marie, that she had destroyed his marriage, that she was a foreign woman preying on a French man. The story was based on letters stolen from Langevin's apartment by his estranged wife, Jeanne, who had hired a locksmith to break into the residence and search for evidence of infidelity. She found love letters, passionate, intimate correspondence between Marie and Paul, and delivered them to the press. The scandal exploded. Right-wing and nationalist newspapers seized the story with vicious enthusiasm. Marie Curie, they wrote, was not merely a homewrecker, but a symbol of everything wrong with modern France: foreign influence, moral decay, the abandonment of Catholic family values, the corrupting power of intellectual women. She was described as a Polish Jew, though she was Catholic, deploying anti-Semitic slurs to amplify the xenophobia. She was called a succubus, a siren, a destroyer of families. Mobs gathered outside Marie's home, throwing stones, shouting threats. She fled with her daughters to the home of friends, moving under cover of darkness to avoid the press. Newspaper editorials called for her expulsion from France. Conservative politicians demanded that the Sorbonne revoke her professorship. The scandal became a proxy war over larger cultural anxieties: the role of women, the threat of immigration, the perceived decline of French moral authority. The irony was that Paul Langevin's marriage had been abusive and dysfunctional long before Marie entered the picture. Jean Langevin was violent, volatile, and manipulative. Paul had sought separation multiple times. His relationship with Marie had developed in the context of profound mutual loneliness. 2 people who had lost their primary emotional anchors, who found solace in intellectual companionship and eventually physical intimacy. But these nuances were irrelevant to the press. The narrative required a villain, and Marie, as a foreign woman, was the obvious target. Paul Langevin, by contrast, faced relatively mild criticism. He was portrayed as a weak man, led astray by a seductive foreigner, but he was not subjected to the sustained vilification that Marie endured. This gendered double standard, a married man's infidelity treated as unfortunate, a widow's treated as criminal, exposed the deep hypocrisy of the era's sexual politics. Marie, for her part, remained publicly silent. She did not defend herself in the press. She did not issue statements or rebuttals. She withdrew into a kind of wounded dignity, refusing to engage with accusations she found beneath response. But privately, she was devastated. Friends described her as shattered, barely able to function. Her daughters were traumatized by the public attacks, the threats, the relocation. Erin, then 14, became protective of her mother, fiercely defensive, developing a lifelong distrust of public attention. Ev, younger and more sensitive, retreated into herself. And then, in the midst of this chaos, a telegram arrived from Stockholm. Marie Curie had been awarded the 1911 Nobel Prize in Chemistry for her isolation of pure radium and determination of its atomic weight. She was the first person in history to receive 2 Nobel Prizes. It was an unprecedented honor, a vindication of her scientific achievements, a recognition that transcended national and gendered biases. But the Swedish Academy, panicked by the scandal, sent a private letter urging her not to attend the ceremony. They suggested that her presence would be inappropriate given the unfortunate circumstances, that it would be better for all parties if she stayed away. Marie Curie refused. She would attend. She would accept the prize. She would not allow her private life to be used as justification for erasing her scientific achievements. In December 1911, she traveled to Stockholm with Irene. She stood before the assembled dignitaries and delivered her acceptance speech with cold precision. She spoke of radium, of radioactivity, of the methods she had developed to isolate and measure radioactive elements. She did not mention the scandal. She did not mention Pierre. She spoke only of the work. It was an act of extraordinary courage, a refusal to be diminished, to be silenced, to allow the violence of public opinion to define her worth. But the cost was severe. Shortly after returning to Paris, she collapsed. She was diagnosed with severe kidney inflammation, possibly exacerbated by radiation exposure, certainly worsened by stress. She underwent surgery. She was confined to bed for months. Her hair grayed almost overnight. Friends described her as aged, hollowed out, a shadow of her former self. For over a year, she lived in seclusion, avoiding public appearances, working only intermittently. She traveled under assumed names to avoid recognition. She moved between rented apartments and friends' homes. The woman who had once worked with relentless discipline, who had processed tons of pitchblende through sheer physical endurance, now struggled to rise from bed. But slowly, incrementally, she began to rebuild. She returned to the laboratory. She resumed training students. She re-established correspondence with international colleagues. She did not forgive the press, the academy, or the society that had attacked her, but she refused to be destroyed by them. And then, in 1914, another transformation arrived, not through her own choice, but through history's convulsion. Europe descended into war. Chapter 7. War. Light on the battlefield. On August 3, 1914, Germany declared war on France. Within days, the tranquil rhythms of Parisian intellectual life disintegrated. Laboratories emptied as scientists were conscripted or volunteered. The Radium Institute, which Marie had been building with support from the University of Paris, and the Pasteur Institute, stood incomplete, a monument to ambition suspended. Marie's immediate concern was radium itself. France possessed nearly the entire national supply. A gram of radium held in lead containers at the Institute. If the German army advanced, the radium could be captured, taken as spoils, used against France, or sold for enormous sums. This was intolerable. She packed the radium in a lead-lined case, borrowed a car, and drove alone through the chaos of mobilization to Bordeaux, where the French government had relocated. She carried the case herself into a bank vault, stored it under a false name, then returned to Paris. It was a small act in the scale of the war, but emblematic of her instinct to protect the work, the legacy, the knowledge that had been so painfully acquired. But Marie did not intend to spend the war in passive preservation. She observed, with growing frustration, that wounded soldiers were being evacuated from front lines to field hospitals without any X-ray diagnostic equipment. Fractures went undetected. Shrapnel lodged in tissue could not be located. Surgeons operated blind, prolonging suffering and reducing survival rates. X-ray technology existed. Wilhelm Röntgen's discovery of 1895 had been rapidly adopted in medical contexts, but the equipment was bulky, expensive, and concentrated in urban hospitals far from the fighting. Marie conceived a solution: mobile radiological units that could be driven directly to field hospitals and battlefronts, bringing X-ray capability to the wounded, rather than waiting for the wounded to be transported to the machines. She began by equipping a car with an X-ray apparatus, a portable generator, photographic plates, and a darkroom for developing images. She drove it herself to hospitals near the front lines, trained medical personnel to operate the equipment, then moved to the next location. The work required not only technical skill, but physical courage. She often worked within range of artillery fire, in makeshift facilities, under conditions of profound uncertainty. The vehicles became known as Petite Curies, Little Curies, affectionate recognition of their origin and utility. Marie eventually equipped 20 such vehicles and established 200 stationary radiological posts throughout France. She recruited and trained women, often young, often from privileged backgrounds, seeking meaningful war work, to serve as radiological technicians. These women, called manipulatrices, learned to operate X-ray machines, develop photographic plates, and interpret images. It was technical, demanding work, and it was often performed under dangerous conditions. Irene, Marie's eldest daughter, became one of the most skilled manipulatrices. At 17, she was stationed at a frontline hospital, working long shifts, sleeping in unheated barracks, performing radiological diagnoses that guided surgeons. She inherited her mother's discipline, her capacity for focus under duress, and her apparent indifference to personal comfort or safety. Marie's wartime service was exhausting. She traveled constantly, trained hundreds of operators, scavenged equipment, navigated military bureaucracies that were often indifferent or hostile to civilian initiatives. She was 50 years old, chronically ill, still recovering from the scandal and its aftermath. But the war offered something she had not possessed in years: a sense of purpose, unambiguous enough to silence doubt. The radiological units saved countless lives. Surgeons located bullets and shrapnel with precision, reducing the need for exploratory surgery. Fractures were identified and set properly. Infections were prevented by earlier intervention. Conservative estimates suggest that over 1 million soldiers were treated using Curie's radiological network. For France, which had vilified her just 3 years earlier, Marie Curie's wartime contributions were rehabilitative. She became, once again, a national heroine, not as a scientist whose private life had scandalized the public, but as a patriot who had served the wounded with selfless dedication. The transformation was pragmatic, opportunistic, but it was also real. She had turned her knowledge toward mercy, had used X-rays to illuminate flesh torn by shrapnel and bone shattered by artillery, had brought light into the darkest moments of human suffering. This was the paradox that defined the arc of her life. The same scientific discoveries that made her vulnerable, that exposed her to radiation, to public scrutiny, to the violence of nationalist backlash, also gave her the capacity to heal. Radium had glowed in the darkness of her laboratory. X-rays, a parallel discovery born from investigations into radiation, now glowed in the darkness of war. Light and shadow, always intertwined. By the war's end in November 1918, Marie was physically depleted. Her vision was deteriorating. cataracts from radiation exposure clouding her eyes. She suffered from chronic fatigue, from anemia, from recurring fevers. But she had survived. She had preserved her institute. She had trained a generation of radiological technicians. She had demonstrated, once again, that science could be put in service of human need. The post-war world brought new challenges and opportunities. The Radium Institute, finally completed, became a center for radioactivity research, attracting scientists from across Europe and beyond. Marie directed it with the same meticulous discipline she had brought to her early research, training students, supervising experiments, building infrastructure. But she also faced a new reality. Radium, which she had discovered and refused to patent, was now a multi-million-dollar industry. Demand had exploded, driven by both legitimate medical applications and dubious commercial products. And Marie Curie, despite being radium's discoverer, had almost no radium to work with. The Institute's supplies were limited. Purchasing additional radium was prohibitively expensive. This irony, that the woman who discovered radium lacked radium, became the basis for an extraordinary American campaign that would, once again, transform Marie's public image. Chapter 8: Radium, Empire, and the Age of Globe. In 1920, Marie Curie received a letter from Marie Mattingly Maloney, an American journalist and editor of a popular women's magazine. Maloney had heard about the Radium Institute struggles and proposed a solution. She would organize a fundraising campaign in the United States to purchase a gram of radium for Curie's research. She would arrange a speaking tour, leverage Curie's celebrity, and mobilize American philanthropy, particularly women's organizations, to support the cause. Marie was initially reluctant. She had no desire to be a public figure again, no appetite for the performances and ceremonies such a tour would entail. But Melanie was persistent, persuasive, and genuinely committed to advancing women in science. She framed the campaign not just as support for Marie Curie, but as a symbol of international scientific cooperation and in women's empowerment. Eventually, Marie agreed. In May 1921, Marie Curie, accompanied by her daughters, sailed to New York. The reception was overwhelming. Thousands of people gathered at the pier to greet her. Newspapers ran front-page stories celebrating Madame Curie, the grieving widow, the selfless scientist, the woman who had sacrificed everything for knowledge. The narrative crafted by Maloney emphasized Marie's poverty, her devotion to science, her lack of material ambition. It was a story designed to elicit sympathy and donations, and it worked spectacularly. Over the course of several weeks, Marie traveled across the United States, visiting universities, women's colleges, research institutions, and philanthropic organizations. She received honorary degrees. She met presidents and industrialists. She was feted at dinners, receptions, and public ceremonies. The climax of the tour was a ceremony at the White House, where President Warren Harding presented her with a gram of radium, purchased through donations, valued at over $100,000. The American tour solidified Marie Curie's status as an international icon, but it also cemented a particular myth: the image of Curie as a martyr to science, a woman who worked in poverty and obscurity, driven solely by altruistic devotion to knowledge. This image was not entirely false. She had indeed worked in difficult conditions, refused to profit from her discoveries, and dedicated her life to research. But it simplified a more complex reality, elating the institutional support she did receive, the resources available to her in later years, and the ways in which her choices, particularly the refusal to patent radium extraction, were both principled and, in retrospect, economically naive. The myth also obscured the darker dimensions of radium's proliferation. By the 1920s, radium had become a commercial phenomenon, marketed with promises that ranged from plausible to fraudulent. Radium therapy was used legitimately in some cancer treatments, targeting tumors with radiation to destroy malignant cells. But radium was also sold in patent medicines, beauty creams, health tonics, and radium water that supposedly cured everything from arthritis to impotence. Products containing trace amounts of radium, or sometimes no radium at all, were advertised as miracle cures, their marketers exploiting the public's fascination with the element's mystique. Most tragically, young women employed as radium dial painters, workers who painted luminous watch faces with radium lace paint, were instructed to lick their brushes to maintain a fine point. The practice exposed them to lethal doses of radium, which accumulated in their bones, causing necrosis of the jaw, anemia, and bone cancers. These radium girls, as they came to be known, suffered horrifically. Their bodies literally glowed in the dark from the radium embedded in their tissue. Many died young, in agony, their cases eventually prompting lawsuits and the establishment of occupational safety standards. Marie was aware of some of these dangers. How could she not be, given her own failing health? But she remained curiously resistant to fully acknowledging radiation's hazards. She continued to handle radioactive materials without adequate protection. She stored samples in her desk. She spoke of radium's risks in measured clinical terms, as though they were manageable inconveniences rather than existential threats. This blindness, or denial, was not unique to Marie. The entire first generation of radioactivity researchers suffered from it. Radiation was invisible, its effects delayed, its mechanisms poorly understood. The causal link between exposure and illness was difficult to establish definitively, and there was perhaps a psychological reluctance to admit that the work they loved was slowly killing them. But the evidence accumulated. Marie's hands were scarred and burned. Her vision deteriorated. She suffered from chronic anemia and recurring fevers. She underwent multiple surgeries for cataracts. Her energy waned. Colleagues who worked in radioactivity labs developed similar ailments. Some died young: cancer, leukemia, organ failure. Yet the work continued. The Radium Institute flourished, producing important research on radioactive decay, isotopes, and the medical applications of radiation. Marie trained dozens of students, many of them women and foreign scientists, who would not have been welcomed elsewhere. She collaborated with researchers across Europe and at America. She served on international scientific committees, advocating for standardized measurements and open exchange of data. In 1929, she made a second trip to America, again organized by Maloney, to raise funds for the Radium Institute in Warsaw, a tribute to her homeland, now finally independent after World War I. The tour was less triumphant than the first. Marie was visibly frail, her health too poor to sustain the demands of public appearances. But she persisted, driven by the same compulsion that had sustained her through decades of labor. The work must continue. By the early 1930s, Marie Curie was one of the most famous women in the world. Her image had been reproduced in newspapers, books, and films. She was celebrated as a symbol of scientific achievement, female empowerment, and international cooperation. Streets and schools were named in her honor. Statues were erected. She had become, in the public imagination, an almost mythical figure, a modern saint of science. But the myth obscured the cost. The glow that had illuminated her career was also consuming her from within. The radium she had isolated with such painstaking effort was decaying in her bones, releasing radiation that disrupted cellular processes, damaged tissue, destroyed her immune system. She was, quite literally, undergoing the same process of radioactive decay she had spent her life studying. Her final years were marked by increasing frailty. She could no longer work in the laboratory for extended periods. Her vision was too poor to read comfortably. She spent time in sanatoriums in the Alps, seeking rest and treatment, but the relief was temporary. In the spring of 1934, she developed a fever that would not abate. She was diagnosed with aplastic anemia, a failure of the bone marrow to produce blood cells, almost certainly caused by radiation exposure. On July 4th, 1934, in a sanatorium in Sallanches, France, Marie Curie died. She was 66 years old. Chapter 9. The Final Half-Life, a Body Worn Down by Its Own Light. The final chapter of Marie Curie's life was not heroic in the conventional sense. There were no dramatic final experiments, no deathbed revelations, no moments of transcendent insight. There was only the slow, relentless decline of a body that had been subjected to decades of radiation exposure, overwork, and deprivation. Her death certificate listed aplastic pernicious anemia as the cause. But the underlying cause was radium, the element she had discovered, isolated, named, and studied with such devotion. Radium's alpha particles, absorbed through her skin and lungs, had lodged in her bones, where they continued to emit radiation, disrupting the production of blood cells. Her body's capacity to renew itself had been destroyed by the very substances she had spent her life understanding. The irony was profound. Marie Curie had illuminated the nature of atomic decay, had demonstrated that atoms were not static but dynamic, that they transformed over time, releasing energy as they did so. And now her own body was undergoing a parallel transformation, not metaphorically but literally, her cells damaged by radiation, her tissues failing, her biological systems collapsing under the cumulative burden of exposure. She had become what she studied. The glow that defined her career had been internalized, absorbed, made corporeal. She was radium's most intimate victim and its most devoted acolyte. Her funeral was small, private, conducted according to her wishes. She was buried beside Pierre in Sceaux, in a simple grave without ostentation. No state funeral, no elaborate monument. Just a quiet interment, attended by family and a handful of close colleagues. But Marie Curie's death was not the end of her legacy. Far from it. The work she had initiated continued, branching into fields she could scarcely have imagined. Her daughter Irene, working with her husband Frédéric Joliot, discovered artificial radioactivity in 1934, the ability to induce radioactivity in stable elements by bombarding them with particles. The discovery earned them the 1935 Nobel Prize in Chemistry, making the Curie family the most decorated in Nobel history. Irene's work built directly on Marie's methods and insights, extending the understanding of atomic transformation into new territory. The Radium Institute, renamed the Curie Institute, remained a center of radioactivity research and cancer treatment. It trained generations of scientists and physicians, contributed to the development of radiotherapy protocols, and served as a model for interdisciplinary collaboration between physics, chemistry, and medicine. But the legacy was double-edged. The same scientific insights that enabled medical advances also paved the way for nuclear weapons. The discovery of nuclear fission in 1938, the splitting of uranium atoms releasing enormous energy, was a direct descendant of Marie Curie's work on radioactivity. Within 7 years, that knowledge would be weaponized in the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Marie did not live to witness these applications. She died in 1934, before fission was discovered, before the Manhattan Project, before the full destructive potential of atomic energy was realized. It is impossible to know how she would have responded. She had always maintained that science itself was neutral, that knowledge belonged to humanity, that the uses to which discoveries were put were ethical, and political questions beyond the scientist's purview. But this position, however principled, could not survive the atomic age intact. The notion that one could discover fundamental truths about nature without bearing responsibility for their application became increasingly untenable as the scale of potential destruction became clear. Marie Curie's life spanned the transition from the age of classical physics, where matter was inert, atoms indivisible, and energy conserved, to the atomic age, where matter could be transformed, atoms split, and energy released on scales that dwarfed anything previously imagined. She stood at the threshold, she crossed it, and the world followed. Epilogue: The Notebooks That Still Glow. In 1995, 61 years after Marie Curie's death, the French government made an extraordinary decision to transfer her remains, along with Pierre's, to the Pantheon in Paris, the mausoleum where France honors its most distinguished citizens. She would be the first woman interred there for her own achievements, not as an adjunct to a husband's legacy. The ceremony was grand, solemn, charged with symbolic significance. President François Mitterrand presided. Marie's granddaughter, Hélène Langevin-Joliot, herself a physicist, attended. The French people who had once attacked Marie as a foreign interloper now claimed her as a national treasure. But the transfer required extraordinary precautions. Marie Curie's coffin was lined with lead. The pallbearers wore protective suits. Her bones, after more than 6 decades in the earth, remained dangerously radioactive. The woman who had discovered radium had become radium, her skeleton emitting the same alpha particles she had measured with such precision in her laboratory decades before. This persistence is not merely symbolic. It is literal, measurable, scientifically verifiable. Marie Curie's notebooks, her laboratory equipment, her furniture, even her cookbooks, are still radioactive. They are stored in lead-lined boxes in the archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. Anyone wishing to consult them must sign a liability waiver, acknowledging the risk of exposure. Researchers wear protective gear, limit their time with the materials, and are monitored for contamination. The half-life of radium-226, the isotope, Mary isolated, is 1600 years. Her notebooks will remain radioactive long after every building she worked in has crumbled, after every institution she founded has dissolved, after her name has faded from popular memory. The glow she created will outlast the civilization that celebrated it. This is the final paradox of Marie Curie's life. Her greatest discoveries are also her most enduring wounds. The light she brought into the world, both the intellectual illumination of understanding atomic structure and the literal glow of radioactive elements, cast shadows that extend across time, across bodies, across the trajectory of human history. She transformed our understanding of matter. She revealed that atoms are not static but dynamic, that they decay, that they release energy, that the universe is not a collection of unchanging substances, but a field of transformations. This insight was liberating, revolutionary, foundational to the entire architecture of modern physics and chemistry. But it was also terrifying. It meant that stability was an illusion, that matter itself was unstable, that the energy released by atomic decay could be harnessed for healing or destruction, that the same knowledge that enabled radiotherapy also enabled nuclear weapons. Marie Curie did not resolve this paradox. She could not. She lived at the beginning of the atomic age when the possibilities seemed limitless and the dangers were only dimly perceived. She gave the world a gift and a burden, a light and a shadow, a glow that heals and poisons in equal measure. Her life, measured in half-lives, was a sequence of transformations. From Maria Skłodowska, the girl studying in secret in occupied Warsaw, to Marie Curie, the scientist isolating radium in a freezing shed, to Madame Curie, the widow and Nobel laureate navigating scandal and war, to the dying woman in a sanatorium, her body consumed by the substances she had discovered. Each transformation released energy, intellectual, emotional, physical, that radiated outward, touching other lives, shaping other trajectories. Her students carried her methods into new fields. Her daughters continued her work. Her example inspired generations of women to enter science. Her discoveries enabled medical advances that saved millions of lives. But each transformation also exacted a cost. The energy released was not free. It came from the decay of stability, from the loss of wholeness, from the gradual consumption of the self by the work. She gave everything: her health, her privacy, her comfort, her emotional reserves, to the pursuit of knowledge. She became a legend, but the legend obscured the suffering, the loneliness, the price of illumination. In the end, Marie Curie's life cannot be reduced to a simple narrative of triumph or tragedy. It was both. It was the story of a woman who transformed science while being transformed by it, who illuminated the structure of matter while being consumed by the light she created, who gave the world radium and was given radium's slow death in return. Her glow has not faded. Her notebooks still emit radiation. Her legacy still casts light and shadow across the landscape of modern science. She discovered that matter decays, that atoms transform, that energy is released through loss. She lived that truth. She embodied it. She became it. And the light she created, the half-life of light that changed everything, continues to decay, continues to emit energy, continues to illuminate and endanger the world she left behind. This is the story of Marie Curie, not the myth, but the life, not the icon, but the woman, not the glow alone, but the glow and the fallout, inseparable, eternal, still glowing in the darkness.